Story 1. Project Manifold, 1947, New Mexico. In late August of 1947, on a restricted Army Air Force's test range south of Alamogordo, engineers assembled what official paperwork described as a rotational stress platform. Unofficial notes called it something else entirely, a device designed to bend localized gravity through controlled angular momentum. No explosives, no propulsion, just mass, speed, and precision. It was built by a small civilian military team led by Dr. Harold M. Keaton, a mechanical engineer pulled from private industry under wartime authority and never fully released. The platform was crewed by modern standards. Concentric steel rings, counter-rotating at extreme velocity, anchored to a reinforced concrete pit. The goal was limited, measured deviation, record strain. Shut it down. Then the instruments disagreed. The test logs, partially declassified in the 1970s, show repeated anomalies. Strain gauges registered load without corresponding force. Pendulum sensors deflected inward, not outward. A calibrated weight dropped through the center reached the floor milliseconds sooner than predicted. Not much, but enough to be impossible. The scans disagreed. No equation matched. They ran it again. The data was recorded by two independent teams using separate equipment. Film cameras captured reference markers, shifting position frame to frame. One technician wrote a margin note, later crossed out. Local drop acceleration inconsistent. Another entry simply reads, "Confirm again." They did. 3 successful runs. Then the 4th, on September 3rd, during a short-duration spin-up. Power surged beyond planned limits, not catastrophically. Cleanly, the central rig deformed inward by less than an inch, enough to shear a mounting bolt. The system shut down automatically. No explosion, no fire, then silence. Within 48 hours, the base received new orders. Project Manifold was terminated without failure designation. All physical components were dismantled and removed under armed supervision. Test footage was seized. Engineers were separated and reassigned to unrelated posts across the country. Keaton was sent north, an Arctic radar station. No laboratory, no staff, no explanation. No one was allowed to keep copies. The official reason, disclosed years later, cited measurement error due to vibration coupling. But no corrective tests were scheduled, no redesign proposed, no peer review permitted. The paperwork ends mid-sentence on the final report. Keaton never published again. He missed his son's first year of life. When asked decades later why the project vanished, a former base administrator offers a single line, recorded in a university oral history archive. They weren't afraid it wouldn't work. They were afraid it did. Once, 3 months later, all remaining manifold materials were reclassified top secret, retroactively, and the clearance code used its surface again, 24 years later. Story 2, Operation Deep Silence, 1951, Pacific Theater. In February of 1951, the U.S. Navy authorized a low-profile acoustic study in the Western Pacific, officially tasked with improving submarine stealth. The program name was Operation Deep Silence. Its stated objective was modest: map undersea sound propagation across varying depths and temperatures. What it found was not. The test platform was a USS Calder, a Below-class submarine retrofitted with experimental hydrophones designed to detect ultra-low and ultra-high frequency bands simultaneously. The team included naval engineers, civilian acousticians, and one linguist, an odd assignment that drew no explanation. On the third night of continuous recording, the sound profile changed. Not louder, not faster, different. The hydrophones registered a persistent null band, a slice of missing sound centered at 17, 6 kilohertz. Ambient noise existed above and below it. Propeller cavitation, marine life, thermal clicks, all present, but at 17, 6 kilohertz. The ocean went silent, not reduced, absent. They recalibrated. Nothing changed. They recorded again. The anomaly followed the submarine as it changed depth and heading. When the Calder cut engines, the null remained fixed relative to the vessel, not the environment. Sonar technicians logged the event across 6 separate reels. One noted, "Absence behaves like a boundary." The recordings were reviewed on board and flagged for priority transmission. That transmission never reached its destination. Within hours, Navy intelligence officers arrived by aircraft carrier. The reels were confiscated. Logbooks were photocopied. then sealed. The linguist was removed from the vessel entirely. No explanation was provided to the crew. Then came the order. All personnel were instructed to sign revised non-disclosure agreements, extending beyond standard classification terms. The experiment was redesignated from acoustic research to navigation calibration, a category that required no final report. Deep silence was officially listed as completed, without results. One technician asked for clarification. No one replied. Back in San Diego, the data was reviewed by a classified analysis group whose conclusions remain sealed. What is known comes from a single surviving memo, released decades later with heavy redactions. One line remains intact. The 6 kilohertz absence cannot be attributed to no mechanical, biological, or environmental factors. The humane cost surfaced quietly. Petty Officer First Class Daniel Ruiz, a senior sonar operator, began experiencing severe disorientation and insomnia after the final recording session. He reported persistent ringing, not at 6 kilohertz, but just below audibility. Medical records show he was discharged within 6 months for neurological instability. He never returned to sea duty. Deep silence did not fail. It simply stopped. No follow-up missions were scheduled. No peer analysis was authorized. The Calder's modified hydrophones were removed and destroyed. The program name disappeared from Navy indices by 1953, but the anomaly did not, because 12 years later, in an unrelated NATO undersea exercise, the same missing frequency will be logged again, using the same measurement language, 176 kilohertz. The anomaly was logged again in 1963. Story 3. The Fort Detrick Regeneration Trials, 1953, Maryland. In early 1953, inside a restricted biomedical wing at Fort Detrick, Army researchers initiated a study officially labeled Accelerated Wound Recovery in Controlled Environments. Unofficially, the language in the lab notes was sharper. Regeneration, not healing. Replacement. The project was small. 6 researchers. Animal subjects only. No press. No outside oversight. The lead investigator, Dr. Eleanor Whitcomb, was a cellular biologist recruited during wartime and retained under classified contract. Her mandate was narrow: test whether targeted chemical and electrical stimulation could trigger rapid tissue regrowth beyond known biological limits. The first results were dismissed, then the tissue came back wrong. Photographs, later removed from the archive, show laboratory mice regrowing damaged muscle fibers within days, not weeks. Scarred tissue failed to form. In 2 cases, amputated digit tips reappear with unaltered bone structure. Lab notebooks describe cell division rates exceeding any documented mammalian baseline. The samples disagreed with theory. Replication succeeded. Controls held. The data was recorded meticulously. Microscopy slides were cataloged. Metabolic byproducts were analyzed. One assistant noted, "Growth appears directive, not random." That line is circled in red pencil in the only surviving photocopy. By the 4th month, the scope quietly expanded. Additional funding arrived without explanation. New equipment was installed overnight, and the clearance classification changed mid-project, from restricted to a compartmented code used only 3 times elsewhere in the 1950s. The same code would surface again years later, attached to unrelated programs. Then the visitors arrived, men without lab coats, no introductions. They asked about scalability, about reversibility, about human application. Whitcomb requested peer review authorization. The request was denied. Instead, she was instructed to prepare a termination summary. She refused. Within a week, the project was halted under an ethical compliance review. The animals were euthanized. Samples were incinerated. All photographic records were seized. Researchers were ordered to surrender notebooks for secure duplication. No copies were returned. One assistant asked what they had done wrong. No answer was given. The lab was sealed. The official report, later declassified in fragments, states that results were inconclusive and non-reproducible. This directly contradicts internal memos referencing repeatable outcomes across multiple cohorts. No external ethics board findings exist. No follow-up study was ever approved. The humane cost was not dramatic. It was administrative. A junior research assistant, Thomas Hale, listed as co-author on early drafts, died in a single car accident 6 months later while commuting to a reassignment posting. His name was removed from all subsequent documentation. His family received no explanation of his work. His contribution does not appear in any index. Whitcomb remained employed but never again led a project. By 1955, the Fort Detrick wing was reorganized, equipment replaced, staff rotated. The Regeneration trials vanished into a footnote labeled discontinued exploratory work. But one thing remained: the clearance code assigned during the final month, identical to the one later used in a classified biomedical revival nearly 4 decades afterward. The same code, the same language, the same silence. In 1971, that clearance classification appeared again. If these first 3 were coincidences, Story 4 will test that theory. Story 4, Project Sky Vault, 1958, Nevada. In May of 1958, on a dry lakebed north of Groom Lake, the Air Force tested an aerial platform that was never meant to be seen. Project Sky Vault did not aim to fly faster. It aimed to disappear from detection entirely, not by altitude or speed, but by collapsing its radar profile into noise. The craft was small, unmanned, triangular, built from composite layers whose exact formulation remains classified. The project lead, Colonel James R. Halloway, described it in a briefing later declassified as a negative presence rather than a vehicle. The language raised no objections at the time. The first test was brief. Ground radar lost the object at 1,200 feet. Not faded, not jammed, gone. Visual observers confirmed the craft remained airborne, maintaining heading and altitude while radar scopes showed clear sky. The disappearance lasted 27 seconds. Then the return, abrupt, centered, clean. The scopes went blank. No spike, no trail. Subsequent tests extended the interval. 30 seconds, 45, over a minute. FAA liaison logs, released decades later, show unexplained radar gaps synchronized across 3 independent stations. Weather was clear. Equipment passed diagnostics. A manned test followed. The pilot, Captain Lawrence Vick, was briefed under extreme compartmentalization. He flew a modified version of the platform with manual override only. During the 3rd pass, Sky Vault vanished from radar as planned. But when Vick attempted to reestablish standard avionics, the cockpit instruments lagged behind reality. His altitude indicator froze. His horizon tilted without motion. He reported it calmly. Then he didn't. The craft reappeared on radar 5 miles off course, descending rapidly. Vick recovered control seconds before impact and landed hard on the lakebed. The aircraft remained intact. The pilot was alive. The test was officially logged as a near miss due to instrumentation error. Within hours, the site was locked down. All radar tapes were confiscated. External observers were dismissed. The prototype was dismantled under armed guard and transported to an unknown location. The test schedule was wiped clean. Project Sky Vault was terminated the same day, without a failure classification. The explanation, issued months later, cited atmospheric ducting effects causing false negative radar returns. No atmospheric anomalies were recorded. No corrective trials were proposed. No independent analysis was permitted. 5 witnesses later recanted simultaneously. Each signed identical affidavits stating their observations were mistaken. Each affidavit was notarized on the same date by the same office, in a building not normally used for Air Force legal processing. The humane cost was contractual. Captain Vick survived a landing, but never flew again. His medical file lists spatial disorientation unrelated to aircraft systems. He was grounded permanently. His family signed a lifetime non-disclosure agreement in exchange for continued benefits. They never spoke publicly. His flight logs end in 1958. By 1960, Sky Vault no longer appeared in procurement records. The materials budget was reassigned to unrelated aerospace programs. The project name was removed from internal indices, but the behavior remained familiar. A breakthrough logged internally. Independent confirmation achieved. Abrupt intervention. Total erasure. And one more detail surfaced years later, buried in a radar technician's notebook archived at a state university. The classification stamp on the Sky Vault tapes matched one used only 4 times in Air Force history. The same stamp would appear again in 1962 during a human trial. Story 5, Operation Mirrorflesh, 1962, California. In the spring of 1962, at a naval medical facility outside San Diego, a program began under an intentionally vague title, Operation MIRFLESH. Officially, it was a study in advanced sensory rehabilitation for injured personnel. Internally, the objective was more precise and more dangerous. Duplicate sensation. The premise was not regeneration or enhancement, but transfer. Researchers hypothesized that the human nervous system could be conditioned to mirror sensory input from a second biological source in real time, not metaphorically, neurologically. Officially, it was a study in advanced sensory rehabilitation for injured personnel. Internally, the objective was more precise and more dangerous. Duplicate sensation. The premise was not regeneration or enhancement, but transfer. Researchers hypothesized that the human nervous system could be conditioned to mirror sensory input from a second biological source in real time, not metaphorically, neurologically. Pain felt by one subject, perceived by another. The setup was clinical and controlled. 2 volunteer subjects, separated by distance, each fitted with custom EEG arrays and peripheral nerve stimulators. No drugs beyond mild sedatives. No hypnosis. Just synchronized neural signaling and patterned electrical input. The first sessions produced noise, then alignment. EEG traces from paired subjects began showing synchronized spikes without direct stimulus. When subject A was exposed to heat, subject B showed involuntary galvanic skin response. When they experienced pressure, B flinched. The charts lined up. The reactions matched. No contact existed. By week 3, the responses intensified. One subject correctly identified the location of a pinprick applied to the other, blindfolded, isolated, and monitored. The lab notes describe it cautiously. Cross-subject perceptual correspondence exceeds statistical expectation. The supervising neurologist ordered replication with new pairings. The effect persisted, though unevenly. In some cases, the mirrored sensation lagged by seconds. In others, it arrived first. That detail troubled the team. Sessions were halted after subject B began reporting pain without stimulus. Sharp, localized, and emotionally distressing. Medical exams found no physical cause. EEG data showed activity consistent with real sensory experience. The files noted discussion of expansion to larger groups. That meeting never occurred. Instead, an ethics review was triggered. Internally, without external oversight. Within days, mirror flesh was suspended for psychological risk. Equipment was impounded. Data drives were seized. Subjects were separated and prohibited from contact. One asked why. No answer was provided. The official termination summary states that results were inconsistent and likely influenced by suggestion and stress. One could argue the observed effects were psychosomatic, amplified by expectation and experimental pressure. But the raw EEG correlations, time-stamped and independently logged, were never addressed in that conclusion. The humane cost followed quietly. Subject B, a 24-year-old naval corpsman, experienced persistent phantom pain for months after the program ended. His medical file records repeated complaints dismissed as anxiety-related. He was eventually transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility. He missed his sister's wedding. He never returned to active duty. The lead researcher requested permission to publish anonymized findings. The request was denied under national security exemption. His security clearance was downgraded. He left government research within the year. Mirror Flesh did not reappear under its own name, but funding linked to the project resurfaced 18 months later, rerouted through a private contractor specializing in human performance. The budget lines were identical. The classification stamp was unchanged. And one final detail, buried in a margin note from the last session, escaped destruction. Subject reports sensation before stimulus. Directionality unclear. The funding resumed under a new name. Story 6. Project Black Current, 1967, North Atlantic. In October 1967, at a temporary naval research platform anchored in the North Atlantic, the Department of Defense initiated Project Black Current. Its objective was narrowly defined and aggressively classified. Transmit directed energy through seawater without measurable loss. Not communication. Power. The prevailing science said it was impossible. Salt water absorbs, dissipates, scrambles. Yet internal proposals argued that under specific electromagnetic configurations, conductive media could be forced to carry coherent energy pulses over distance. If true, it would eliminate the need for cables, surface relays, or line-of-sight transmission. The platform was improvised but well-funded. A converted drilling rig housed generators, capacitor banks, and a submerged emitter array. The receiving station sat 3 miles away, fully isolated. No shared infrastructure, no optical link. The first activation lasted 6 seconds. Sensors on the receiving end registered a sudden, localized energy spike, far exceeding ambient levels. without any corresponding signal loss along the path. The water temperature remained stable. No cavitation. No expected dispersion. The meters spiked. The water stayed calm. The link held. A second test extended the pulse duration, 12 seconds, then 20. On the third run, instrumentation at the receiver began to fail, not from overload, but from internal melting inconsistent with recorded power input. A technician shut the system down manually. Review of the data showed something worse. Energy appeared to arrive before the emitter reached peak output. The timestamps disagreed by fractions of a second. Engineers recalibrated clocks. The discrepancy remained. They tried again. During the fifth test, a feedback surge traveled backward through the system, bypassing safeguards. A technician standing near the capacitor bank was thrown to the deck. He survived. His hearing did not. Medical reports document permanent auditory damage with no external blast signature. The humane cost was immediate. He never returned to technical work. Within 72 hours, Project Black Current was halted under emergency authority. Navy legal officers issued a patent secrecy order covering all related components, effectively freezing the technology. The platform was dismantled at sea. Core equipment was dropped overboard under supervision. Remaining hardware was transported to an undisclosed facility. The official explanation cited catastrophic design instability. No redesign effort followed. No failure analysis was circulated. Requests for data access were denied, even to senior engineers. The lead physicist submitted a formal protest. His clearance was suspended pending review. He was reassigned to an administrative post and resigned within months. By 1970, the research unit that hosted Black Current no longer existed. Its charter was dissolved, its personnel scattered, its budget absorbed into unrelated programs. No continuation appeared in public records, but the pattern sharpened. A phenomenon that contradicts known limits. Partial success, escalating anomalies, immediate suppression. And one more detail emerged years later, buried in a declassified naval procurement appendix. The secrecy order issued for Black Current remained active for 50 years, automatically renewing without review. From here on, the pattern stops asking for permission. The lab no longer existed. Story 7, the White Sands Time Drift Test, 1971, New Mexico. In July of 1971, during a routine weapons diagnostics exercise at White Sands Missile Range, technicians noticed a discrepancy they were not looking for. The test involved no new hardware, no experimental physics, just synchronization, multiple atomic clocks, cesium beam standards maintained under strict calibration, were positioned at varying distances from a controlled detonation used to validate telemetry systems. The objective was simple: confirm timing accuracy across the range to within nanoseconds. The clocks disagreed, not randomly, not gradually, systematically. Post-test analysis showed that 2 clocks positioned closest to the blast registered time ahead of the control units by several nanoseconds, not lagging, as signal delay would predict, advancing. The discrepancy persisted after recalibration and power cycling. Technicians flagged the anomaly as instrument error. Replacement clocks were installed. The test was repeated under identical conditions. The drift returned. Internal memos, later partially released, no concern about localized temporal desynchronization. The phrase appears once, then disappears from subsequent documentation. A senior physicist annotated the margin of a printout with a single word: impossible. They ran a third test. This time, the detonation yield was reduced. The clocks were repositioned. Shielding was added. The result was smaller, but present. A measurable lead of time in proximity to the event, collapsing back to baseline minutes later. The numbers were small. The implication was not, if accurate. The data suggested that under specific energy densities, time itself was not behaving uniformly, not enough to travel, enough to desynchronize. The findings were escalated within days. The experiment was reclassified from diagnostics to instrument validation. The original data sets were sealed. External consultation with the National Bureau of Standards was requested, then canceled. The clocks were removed from service and returned to the manufacturer for maintenance. The humane cost came through pressure. The physicist who first insisted the drift was real submitted a request to publish a technical note on synchronization anomalies. He was advised informally to withdraw it. When he refused, his access credentials were downgraded. He resigned within a year, citing administrative interference in a letter never sent. The official conclusion: issued internally, attributed the discrepancy to electromagnetic interference from the blast. No supporting calculations were provided. No replication was authorized under controlled laboratory conditions. The paperwork ends abruptly, yet the anomaly refused to stay buried. A handwritten annotation on a sealed White Sands report, uncovered decades later in a university archive, references a prior occurrence. Compared to Naval Acoustic Desync, 1967. No explanation follows. No citation is given. The clocks were accurate. The math was clean. The data vanished. By 1972, the event was no longer listed in White Sands test summaries. The detonation itself was logged. The timing experiment was removed entirely, and one final detail lingered, almost invisible. The classification stamp applied to the drift data matched one used in only a handful of other cases. Among them, an undersea energy test and a biomedical trial long thought unrelated. The same language, the same suppression, the same quiet exit, the same drift appears again, years earlier. Story 8, Operation Deep Silence, Reappearance, 1963/1984, NATO waters. In March of 1963, 12 years after Operation Deep Silence was quietly closed, the anomaly returned, this time without permission. During a multinational NATO undersea exercise in the North Atlantic, acoustic analysts from 3 countries logged an identical irregularity, a narrow, persistent absence in the sound spectrum, centered at the same frequency, logged independently, flagged within hours. 17, 6 kilohertz, different vessels, different equipment, same silence. The initial assumption was calibration drift, then equipment failure, then coincidence. Those explanations collapsed quickly. The null band appeared across British, American, and Norwegian sonar systems, each built to different specifications, each verified against internal controls. The ocean sounded normal, except for the gap. One analyst noted something new. The absence behaved dynamically, shifting slightly with vessel movement, but resisting environmental variables. Depth changes didn't matter. Temperature gradients didn't matter. Engine noise didn't matter. It followed the observers. The report was escalated to NATO command and immediately reclassified above the level of the exercise itself. Data sharing was halted. Participating crews were instructed to log the event under a generic code, meaning ambient interference. No ambient source was ever identified. The humane cause surfaced through procedure. A civilian acoustic analyst seconded to the exercise, Dr. Martin Keller, was tasked with consolidating the data. He noticed something unsettling. The descriptive language in the 1963 logs matched phrasing from an older U.S. Navy memo he had encountered years earlier during a fellowship. Same wording, same diagrams, same frequency. Keller requested access to historical archives to compare datasets. His request was denied. 2 days later, he was removed from the exercise and told his clearance status required administrative review. He was last seen boarding a transport flight back to the continental United States. He never arrived. In 1984, the anomaly surfaced again, this time during a classified deep ocean listening program unrelated to NATO exercises. The sensors were fixed, the environment controlled. The results were worse. The null band appeared intermittently, then stabilized. When it did, marine biological noise and adjacent frequencies diminished noticeably, as if local organisms were avoiding the zone. The silence expanded, then contracted, then vanished. Internal correspondence, later leaked in fragments, shows senior analysts debating whether the absence represented a masking effect or an active phenomenon. One line survives intact. Absence implies interaction. The response was immediate. An Allied classification override was invoked, superseding national authority. All participating countries were bound to silence under a shared security protocol used only in extreme cases. Data was compartmentalized. Analysts were reassigned. The program was officially described as inconclusive. No press leak followed. No inquiry surfaced. The humane cost landed quietly again. A junior analyst who questioned why biological noise dropped near the null band was reassigned to shore duty and later left defense work entirely. He missed the birth of his first child while attending mandatory debriefings. He never spoke publicly about the program, but the pattern was now undeniable. Same frequency, same language, same suppression response. And one final connection emerged, buried in a declassified NATO annex, a cross-reference to AU. S, Navy Index Number, identical to the one used in the original deep silence seizure order. The breadcrumb had returned. Now the pattern was undeniable. Story 9. The Regeneration files reopen, 1991, United States. In 1991, nearly 4 decades after the Fort Detrick regeneration trials were sealed, the files resurfaced by accident during a digitization effort mandated by a post-Cold War records consolidation order. A civilian contractor flagged a box mislabeled as agricultural research. Inside were degraded microfilms, tissue growth charts, and grainy photographs marked with a clearance code no longer in active use. The same code assigned in 1953. The images were unmistakable. Mammalian tissue regrowth, clean margins, no scarring, bone structure restored, not approximated. Notes in the margins referenced stimulation protocols that had never been published. The contractor reported the find through proper channels. The response was immediate. Within hours, the digitization team was removed from the facility. The box was seized. The contractor was instructed to sign a retroactive non-disclosure agreement covering material he had already seen. The incident was logged as a misfiled archival anomaly, but copies had been made. A junior analyst inside the agency, assigned to verify destruction, retained scans of several frames. He compared them against modern biomedical literature. Nothing matched. Stem cell research did not account for the structure. Growth factor models failed. The tissue appeared to remember its original form. The analyst raised a question. The question triggered an audit. Internal emails, later obtained through litigation, show rapid escalation. Phrases repeat. Legacy exposure, classification conflict, non-attributable origin. A decision was made to reseal the entire Fort Detrick series under a new legal authority. Then enforcement followed. The analyst was charged under a broad interpretation of information handling statutes. His clearance was revoked. His career ended. He lost custody of his children during the legal proceedings. The scans were entered into evidence, then disappeared from the court record. The humane cost was complete. In testimony, the government argued the images were misinterpreted artifacts. No expert analysis was permitted. The case was closed with a plea agreement. The analyst was prohibited from discussing the matter for life. The files were not destroyed. They were reclassified at a higher level than before. One internal memo, released years later with heavy redaction, contains a single intact sentence. Prior regeneration outcomes remain unexplainable under current models. The author's name is removed. The date remains. The reopening had confirmed what the original team already knew. The effect had been real, the suppression deliberate, the risk unresolved. And for the first time, the regeneration work was formally linked by classification authority, not science, to 2 other anomaly clusters, undersea acoustic nulls and energy transmission experiments. 3 domains, 1 response. The files were sealed again in 1991, this time with no automatic declassification date. 1 experiment remained unaccounted for. Story 10. Project Null Vector. Date unknown. Officially denied. There is no formal start date for Project Null Vector. No charter. No procurement trail. No termination order. It exists only through absence, through the way unrelated programs were quietly folded into the same classification container, then erased together. Null Vector was not a single experiment. It was a convergence file. In the late 1980s, a classified index was created inside a defense record system to group anomalies that share no discipline but produce the same problem. Outcomes that violated baseline assumptions and resisted containment. Acoustic nulls, regenerative biology, energy transmission, temporal drift. Each was logged elsewhere as isolated. Null Vector treated them as related. The surviving evidence is thin by design. A single index card was recovered during a 2002 records audit, misfiled among budget placeholders. No letterhead, no signatures, just a title, a clearance stamp, and 4 handwritten entries. 17. 6 kilohertz absence directive tissue regrowth pre-arrival energy spike. Localized time. Lead no explanations follow. The card references no facilities, no personnel, only dates. Some matching known experiments. Others corresponding to gaps where record should exist. One date aligns with the 1951 deep silence seizure order. Another matches the final month of the Fort Detrick trials. A third corresponds to the Black Current shutdown. Different domains. Same anomalies. Same file. The implication is structural. Null Vector appears to have been an internal attempt to determine whether these effects were expressions of a single underlying phenomenon. Not weapons, not technologies, but boundary conditions where conventional cause and effect failed. If so, The danger was not adversarial use. It was unpredictability. The humane cost was embedded in policy. A redacted personnel memo linked to the index card references a primary integrator, a senior researcher tasked with correlating the data. His name is removed. His employee number is not. That number leads nowhere. Payroll records skip it entirely, as if it were never issued. No obituary exists. No reassignment record appears. His authorship credit is blank. The official position, repeated across agencies, is that Project No Vector never existed. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act return the same phrase. No responsive records. Yet the clearance stamp on the index card matches the one used to seal every experiment you've just heard. That stamp was never designed for weapons. It was designed for containment of knowledge. The final notation on the card is written smaller than the rest, almost as an afterthought. Vector cannot be neutralized, only avoided. No date, no initials. If that assessment was correct, suppression was not a cover-up. It was a decision to abandon lines of inquiry that worked once and threatened to work again without warning. The erasure was the experiment, because when faced with something that crosses domains, ignores categories, and defies control, the system did not adapt. It disappeared the evidence, and then it waited. The record ends here.